Do you ever just look at a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs and just think, wow, these guys were just meant to do this? I mean, they have so much talent. Well, today's guest tells us why that's not true. Anyone can be as successful as Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. Talent, ultimately, doesn't really exist. Hear him explain this and how this mentality got him hired at Goldman Sachs, straight out of college. That's right, stay tuned because we've got a great interview coming up next on Peak Performers Podcast.
Welcome to this edition of Peak Performers Podcast with your host, Thor Conklin. Thor will be sharing the necessary tools, strategies, and psychology you'll need to become a peak performer in any area of your life or business.
Thor Conklin here. We give you the tricks, the tips, the tools, the strategy, the technology, and the psychology peak performers use in order to get more done and execute at the highest level. If you know what to do but struggle with getting it all done, or simply want to raise your game to the next level, this podcast is for you. Sit back and enjoy.
Today's guest is Matt Bodnar, a rising restaurateur and strategy pro. Matt specializes in deal making and scaling companies in the food and beverage industry. Matt is also a partner at Fresh Hospitality, the host of Science of Success, the #1 evidence-based personal growth podcast on iTunes with over 1 million downloads, and former Goldman Sachs employee. Trust me, you do not want to miss what this star in peak performance has to say.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I know the audience is going to get so much out of it. I've been looking forward to this interview. Forbes 30 under 30. Man, bring us up to speed. How did it all happen?
Well, Thor, thank you so much for having me on the show today. I'm super excited, and hopefully we can drop some knowledge for your listeners. So I guess starting out, do you want me to talk specifically about how I got 30 under 30, or do you want me to go all the way back and kind of tell you a little bit more about myself?
Let's start from the beginning.
Perfect. All right. So I was kind of a normal kid. And then I was bitten by a radioactive spider. No, I'm just kidding. I started out, I never really had like any kind of aspirations to be quote unquote super successful or whatever. And I kind of stumbled upon it by dumb luck. When I was in high school, I was a debater, and I kind of the first brush with success I had was I won the high school debate national championship my senior year, and upon winning it, I didn't kind of set out this strategy to win it. I just sort of ended up winning it, and I kind of realized like top performance or peak performance isn't something that's unattainable. It's actually something that, with the right work, with the right strategies, whatever, anybody can do it. Because I realized if I could do it, I know anyone else could do it. And so that really started kind of piqued my interest more broadly in the idea of, okay, if I can look at any human on the planet, right? And Steve Jobs kind of talked about this idea too, that like everything around you is made by another human. It was an idea in their brain that then became built and then became, was assembled by humans, and now you have it. And so I kind of thought about success in the same way, which is basically like anybody out there, whether they're Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Warren Buffett or whoever, their success leaves clues and blueprints, and there's things that you can follow to get there. And so throughout my life, I've really studied very deeply the most successful kind of people on the planet. And I'm a biography nut. I read a ton of history, biographies, all kinds of stuff, in addition to heaps and heaps of self-help and psychology and all kinds of other books. But I've always been obsessed with how do these titans of finance and industry and people like John D. Rockefeller and all of these amazing achievers achieve their goals. And so that kind of innocuous event in high school kind of set me on this path and this journey of figuring out like, hey, if I can do it, I know other people can do it too. And there's been a lot of lessons along that journey as well. And we can get into the pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, well, let's dive into this because, you made an interesting comment. It's like anybody can do it. Can anybody do it, or do we need to start with a basic, EQ or IQ in order to really get the exceptional results?
I believe, and there's a lot of research to back this up. I'm a huge proponent of the book Mindset by Carol Dweck, and I don't know if you're familiar with that book or if we've talked about it on here, but that book to me was one of the seminal inflection points in my life, and it completely transformed the way that I thought about myself, my ability to achieve results, and kind of my own identity. And one of the core premises of what so Dr. Carol Dweck is a research psychologist. She's researched hundreds of thousands of people. Literally, at one point, did a study on the entire 8th grade population of the country of Chile. But dozens and dozens of studies, very, very validated research conclusions, essentially asking this question, what enables people to achieve amazing results, and kind of what stopped people from achieving amazing results. And she breaks it down into what she calls the fixed mindset and the growth mindset, which are malleable and changeable. And the science of neuroplasticity shows that you can actually rewire and reshape the structure of your brain to change the way that you perceive yourself and your results. But the core thing that she talks about is basically the idea that everybody has a different starting point. There's no question about that, from skills, abilities, resources, etc. But in terms of achieving great results, I think your starting point only matters so much, and really the vast majority of it comes from things like deliberate practice, which there's another book by a guy named Jeff Colvin called Talent is Overrated. That's an amazing book that looks at people from things like athletics, musicians, world-class chess players, all kinds of different fields, and basically asks again and again, does talent exist? And the overwhelming conclusion of the data and the research is that it really doesn't. All of us start from a different place, but we can, with hard work and deliberate practice, get to wherever we want to get.
Bring us back to the debating years. A national debater, champion. What are some of the lessons that you've learned there, and what are some of the techniques and the skills that were necessary in order to be a champion?
So I would say one of the biggest things, I would highly, highly recommend debating. First of all, if you have kids or if you're young and you're listening to this, debate was the single biggest and most impactful thing that I did in school. If I had to stack up every single class that I took in high school versus debate, I would say I probably learned 10x from debate versus the aggregate of everything else I did in high school. It teaches you how to think. It teaches you how to research. It teaches you how to read information. It teaches you how to synthesize information and draw meaningful conclusions from it. It teaches you how to speak. It teaches you how to argue and advocate for ideas. It teaches you how to present. In many ways, I think debate was the cornerstone of what enabled me to be successful throughout my life, and really helped me land my first job out of college and helped me kind of set myself on the trajectory that I've been on since then.
Yeah, every leader needs those skills. Now, you also worked for Goldman. Now, they don't just hire anybody. What was the secret about getting into Goldman?
So the next bit of my journey, out of undergrad, I actually, when I was in school still, I got an internship at Goldman my junior year, which is kind of the standard way you get into the banking world. And then out of college, I worked there for a couple years in the interest rate derivatives desk. And I would say the thing that differentiated me the most, I was a poli-sci major, by the way. I was actually thinking about going to law school because of the debate.
And you didn't cause the crash in 2008, did you? Working on the interest desk?
I definitely didn't. Actually, I was interning before the crash, and then the crash happened my senior year. And they basically, I had kind of a job offer there, and they pulled the offer during the crisis. So I went through the majority of my senior year of college not having a job when I was graduating. And then right after I graduated, they called me back and they were like, hey, we just realized that we literally, we didn't have a single person hired, and our hiring freeze is over. So will you please come work for us? So that was a very rocky road, and the crisis definitely didn't help. And a lot of people in my kind of generation, or, the people that graduated with me, really got hammered by that. But circling back to, what I think enabled me to get a job there was really differentiating myself. And one of the big things that I did, if you think about everybody who works in investment banking, the average path that they tell you to pursue in college is be a finance major, get good grades, join the investment club, blah, blah, blah. And actually I helped out with intern recruitment when I was on the desk there. And you would see 10 resumes and they're almost all exactly the same. And my resume was completely different. I was a poli-sci major. I was a debater, which I think hands down debate was the single best skill for we're learning and going into the kind of the investment banking and the financial world. But the biggest differentiator too was that I spent some time studying abroad and living in China. So I lived in China for about 6 months, my junior year of college. I worked for a Chinese import-export consulting company while I was over there. Used to speak a little bit of Mandarin. Now it's really it's degraded dramatically because I haven't used it in 10 or 15 years. But I think that set my resume apart enough that I was able to kind of differentiate from the other 10 people who were all competing for the same spot that all had the exact same resume. Mine was completely different.
Yeah, let's talk about China for a second, because I had an import business we manufactured over in Asia. And it's really interesting because I think a lot of U.S. companies kind of disregard the rest of the world and say, it's China. They're really not going to be competitive with us. One of the things that I found very, very interesting, other than their work ethic and the amount of time that they actually do go to work, is they're highly organized. I remember just going to meetings with mid-level employees. Every single one spoke fluent English and had their books out and were making copious notes on everything that we said. And were able to repeat back everything verbatim. So it was really interesting. I was surprised by that level of, quite frankly, tenacity in their workforce. What did you find?
I was only working over there for a couple months, so I didn't get as detailed of a view. But I would say like a couple things. One, I totally agree with your point. And actually, there's a statistic that there's more people who speak English fluently in China than there are in the United States, which is a crazy stat.
Yeah.
And that's amazing, right? But the other piece too, more broadly, even kind of expanding beyond just business people in Asia. I think whenever I have a meeting, like I take copious notes. I basically live in Evernote. I have like 9,000 notes in my Evernote folder or whatever. I whenever I have a meeting, I have a notebook. I take all my notes. I take a picture or store those in Evernote. I basically try to organize and capture all the information that's coming at me. And whenever I have a meeting with someone, I'm sitting there like taking notes, writing all these things down, follow-ups, like people I want to introduce them to, action items coming out of the meeting, and they sit there, they're just like looking at me, without taking any notes, without doing anything. I'm always kind of stunned. Like it kind of blows my mind that you could sit through an entire meeting with someone and not take any notes. I mean, I'm being interviewed in this interview and I'm taking notes. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I want to point out something here for our listeners. Are you 29? You're 30 at this point?
So I'm 30 now.
Yeah, 30.
Almost 31.
Right. So for everyone out there listening that's entrepreneurs that are saying, the millennials this, the millennials that, this is the millennial age right here. You're hearing from one right now. This guy is on the ball. Do not paint this entire group of people with a broad brush.
And I would say I'm definitely different than the average millennial, but I think in many ways, millennials get misunderstood.
Absolutely.
And I'm definitely not an expert in millennial relations with other generations, but I do think that dealing with and thinking about millennials, you have to kind of approach things from a little bit of a different perspective.
Yes, you do. But to write them off as an entire class of, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they don't have a good work ethic, all they want is to have a ping pong table in the office, is not a very good way of looking at that particular group of people. Because I find that some of the smartest, most innovative people I've met are part of the millennial group.
And in many ways, I think I credit I'm ruthlessly competitive individual, and anything I do, I want to be the absolute best at it. And I credit that to, it's funny, it never really dawned on me until my wedding reception a couple years ago. My brother, I'm the youngest of four. My brother was giving a speech about playing Street Fighter with me on the Super Nintendo when I was like 8. And he basically told this story about how he and my other brother would just mercilessly destroy me over and over and over again. It's just never give me any, like, an inch of ground. And I think that in many ways that, having kind of some older siblings that were willing to just ruthlessly beat me over and over again in competition made me a much more fierce competitor than kind of the average stories you hear about everybody getting a completion trophy and all of those kind of things.
Yeah, competition does that. It builds character. What do they say? The strongest tree in the forest is the one that's blown the hardest. And I think as a society, we've moved away from that. I mean, I remember when I first started working in New York City back in the 80s, it was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. There was no, coddling. It was tough. And if you didn't stand up and you didn't make it, you just fell by the wayside.
And I mean, my experience even today, not today, but a number of years ago when I worked in New York at Goldman, it was very much a similar environment. It was it would almost taught me in a negative way how not to deal with or manage employees, because everybody there is so talented that they'll basically explain something to you exactly once or tell you something exactly once, and like if you don't get it that one time, that's it. You don't get another chance. You screw it up, that's on you, and you're going to get in big trouble. And so they kind of have that culture of like, you get exactly one opportunity to learn this thing or ask this question or do whatever. And it was so ruthless, but at the same time, I think it's actually kind of a negative lesson in the sense that like when you're managing a company or working with employees, unless you're hiring, the best of the best from Harvard Business School every year, you have to have more flexibility than that. You can't be so brittle in the sense that you can't approach everyone and say, you get one opportunity to learn this and then you're done, right? Like you have to be more flexible and understand that it's going to take follow-up. It's going to take time to explain things to people, and you got to keep track of, hey, did you execute this thing? Hey, did you do XYZ? And they have the luxury of not having to do that. But I think in many ways it was a lesson I had to unlearn when I started managing people.
I had a mentor when I first got into business or in the business world, Jack Schramm. He was the old crotchety, nasty guy that sat in the corner, but of course was in the industry forever and ever. And I was constantly in his office asking questions. Who was one of your mentors growing up?
I would say the person that more than anything has shaped kind of how I view my life and kind of think about, what I want to be is my father. He's an incredibly successful entrepreneur. He's been in the restaurant business for 40 years, maybe more than that. He started out as a Wendy's franchisee in the early 70s, built up a company, IPO'd his operating company, sold it back to Wendy's International, started doing all kinds of different stuff in the restaurant space. And he lived a very different life than a lot of other people. And I kind of started to realize that the older and older I got, and the wisdom that he would impart to me about, thinking about personal freedom and financial freedom and all of these other kind of components were lessons that I really took to heart. And I think he was a major force in kind of shaping the way that I think about time. I think about investing capital. I think about, how I kind of live my life.
You now have the opportunity to work with him at Fresh Hospitality. What are some of those lessons?
I touched on them a little bit, but I think fundamentally the biggest lesson, and this harkens back to Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and kind of those, that's sort of the essence of it. And if you read that book, if you haven't read that book, it's a great book, very simple but powerful strategies in there. But essentially the idea that, I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but like when you think about the way certain people view money, right? I make money and think about money as a tool, and I make money to invest it first and spend it second, right? Whenever I get money in, my number one thing that I think about is how can I deploy this money back so that I can get more money, so that I can reinvest it again and continue to build what Warren Buffett would call a snowball that rolls downhill and accumulates more and more and more and more, right? And that's essentially the strategy that he used at Berkshire Hathaway to turn that company into one of the largest and most successful businesses all the time, make himself and his business partner, Charlie Munger, billionaires, and many other people, incredible amounts of wealth. And it's this notion that if you have control over your time and control over your destiny by building up a passive income stream and letting your money work for you instead of working for money, that's really when you can flip the switch and start to create tremendous amount of leverage from the sense of time and spending your time on things that create long-term value and annuity cash flows instead of spending your time trying to earn income that you then go spend on things like cars and houses and other kind of amenities.
Yeah, we run a profitability consulting firm, and one of the things I'm always driving into my clients is, look, make sure that the first thing that you're taking out is your profitability. Forget about all the expenses. Don't put that first. Income minus expenses equals profitability. Income minus your profitability should then be the expenses that you use to run that business. And it's a completely different mindset of making sure that you're protecting that, because why are we in business in the first place?
Exactly. And I think, zooming out, when I look at, as I talked about earlier, when I've studied and read and looked at people like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, all of these incredible achievers, when I look at the way that they spend their time, in what I would call a very high leverage way, right? And they think about, let's look at it this way. If you have somebody who's making $50,000 a year, right? And they're earning that as kind of an income or an hourly rate or whatever. If they want to double their income, the way most people would think about that is, okay, I need to work twice as hard and I can make twice as much money. The problem is that math starts to break down the higher and higher you go. When you look at somebody like Warren Buffett, and I don't remember the exact stat, but there was a stat that came out a couple years ago that was essentially he makes like $20 million a minute or something is totally ridiculous, right? Maybe it was $20 million an hour or whatever, but it's some staggeringly high number. And like you can't be working, 200,000 times harder to make that much money. At some point he did something that like the difference there is not that he's working 200,000 times harder. It's that he's doing something that's 200,000 times more high leverage than what the other person is doing. And I'm not talking about leverage in a financial sense of borrowing money, but I'm talking about leverage in the sense of the 80-20 principle and the idea that he's doing the very few highly important things that produce massive results and ruthlessly cutting out all of the other pieces of the puzzle that are distractions, wastes of time, reacting to emails and all this other junk that gets thrown at us every day. The people who, and this is a lesson that you see it again and again and again in the patterns as you study the most successful individuals in on the planet and in our history, they all have this relentless focus on leveraging their time to achieve the maximum amount of results for the minimal amount of input possible.
Yeah, default has to be no. No should be the default. What gets the yes are just the few that are the high payback activities. Absolutely correct. Thank you so much for listening today. I really do appreciate your time, and I hope you found today's show valuable. If you would like to receive these shows automatically to your phone or to your computer, simply go to iTunes and subscribe. After listening to several of the shows, if you're so inclined, please leave us a 5-star rating, as this helps us reach additional people and spread the message. If you're truly committed to taking your life to the next level and doing whatever it takes to become a peak performer, but something's holding you back, something is blocking your way, and you just can't seem to figure out what it is, send me an email to info@thorconklin.com, and I'd be more than happy to get on the phone with you. We'll schedule a 15-minute discovery call. No obligation, no cost. I absolutely love to hear from the listeners, and if there's something I can do to help, I'd be more than happy to do that. Also, if you found something of great interest in today's show and you want to share that with your friends and family, simply go to my Facebook page, Thor Conklin. Click on the episode, hit the share button, and share it on your page. You can follow me at Twitter at Thor Conklin. The website is thorconklin.com. We're constantly adding new free resources, discussing additional tricks, tips, tools, and strategies on how to be a peak performer. Remember, I try to keep these episodes short so you can listen to them during dot time, doing other things, commuting, driving, walking, working out. Decide to be a peak performer in all that you do. And until tomorrow, have an absolutely amazing day.
Be on the lookout for part 2 of our talk with Matt, where he tells us what separates winners and losers in the food and beverage industry, and his secret to making the Forbes 30 Under 30 list. See you next time on Peak Performers Podcast.